The artifact sits, harmless now, under the archival glass of the historic New Orleans collection. It is a simple, ivory-handled baby brush, the silver ferrule tarnished black with the air of centuries. It would belong to any nursery, unremarkable, except for the tiny, almost invisible etching on the handle, the initials A.L. But this brush was not found in a nursery. It was discovered in the cold, damp earth beneath the raised foundations of a Magazine Street slave quarter, wrapped not in linen, but in the pages of a discarded Picayune newspaper from the brutal winter of 1835. And it was found resting beside a small, perfectly preserved wooden box containing a lock of hair the startling, shimmering white gold of an angel's halo. For years, the find was a peculiar footnote, an odd piece of history, hinting at a wealthy child misplaced, perhaps forgotten. But then, the forensic genealogist traced the initials. Ale did not belong to the master's family. They belonged to Amélie Laveau, a slave woman, a laundress on the same plantation, recorded only in the ledger as property, age 22, good breeder. And that golden lock of hair, impossibly pale against the dark cotton it was wrapped in, was not the hair of any child belonging to her master, John Caldwell. It was the hair of a baby Amélie had birthed, a baby documented in the Caldwell ledgers as female mulatto, sold to Natchez, age 4 months. But the child sold was not mulatto. She was white passing, and the price John Caldwell received for her was not the price of a slave. It was the price of a white child, a staggering $1,800, paid not by a plantation owner, but by a wealthy, childless Boston merchant couple who believed they were adopting a poor, orphaned Creole baby. This was not an isolated incident. Across the swamps and iron-lace balconies of Antebellum New Orleans, an unsettling pattern began to emerge, a whispered terror hidden in the meticulously kept ledgers of the city's most prominent families. It was a secret born in the shadows of the slave quarters and sold under the blinding light of the society ballrooms, the systematic sale of white-passing children, born to enslaved women, but passed off as pure white orphans. This practice involved not just one master, but a consortium of powerful men, a network of doctors, midwives, and priests, all complicit in a horrifying, calculated commerce that blurred the very line of race and property in the fever dream capital of the South. Tonight we unravel the dark, serpentine trail of the Immaculate Deception, a conspiracy that destroyed families, corrupted the soul of a city, and left an unknown number of innocent children unknowingly living a monstrous lie. Before we continue with the story of Amélie Laveau and the Immaculate Deception, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. The fever dream capital of 1830s, America. To understand the cold horror of the Vente Blanche, the white sail, we must first feel the suffocating heat and the intoxicating complexity of New Orleans in the 1830s. America was a nation splitting at the seams. North was clanging with the new sounds of industrial looms. South was smelling the heavy, sickly sweet scent of cane sugar and cotton. But New Orleans, positioned at the mouth of the continent, was a unique, chimeric beast. It was not truly north or south. It was a port city, a grand, rotting nexus of global commerce where French aristocracy, Spanish bureaucracy, American capitalism, and African resilience curdled together into a peculiar, intoxicating culture. The social structure was a towering, fragile card house built upon 3 fundamental and fiercely policed pillars: white, free people of color, gens de couleur libres, and slave. The air of the Vieux Carré, or the French Quarter, was perpetually heavy. It smelled of sulfur from the nearby sugar refineries, the pungent sweetness of decaying fruit from the markets, and the persistent metallic tang of the Mississippi River, which brought the world to its docks and carried fortunes away. The iron-lace balconies dripped with dew and bougainvillea, concealing elegant darkened parlors where society thrived on appearance and reputation. On any given night, you could hear the distant, lilting strains of a French quadrille emanating from a grand ball, while just 3 blocks away, in the dark, unpaved alleys of the slave quarters, the deep, hypnotic beat of African drumming signaled a gathering far older and more sacred. This intense, fluid mixture created a social paradox. While the Code Noir, the Black Code, was brutally strict, dictating every facet of a slave's life, New Orleans also boasted the largest, wealthiest, and most educated population of free people of color in the nation. These were men and women who owned property, ran businesses, spoke French, and often dressed with a sophistication that rivaled the white aristocracy. This in-between class, often light-skinned and educated in Paris, created a permanent, visible anxiety for the dominant white class. The line was supposed to be absolute. Black was slave, white was free. But New Orleans made that line porous, and this porosity was the crack through which the darkness would seep. Race in New Orleans was not just color. It was status, and status was money. A perfectly white-skinned child of a slave woman was a walking contradiction, a biological loophole that, if hidden, could fetch a fortune. A slave was a depreciating asset. Fed, housed, and clothed, they produced revenue, but their market value was fixed by labor and fertility. A white-presenting child, sold quietly to a wealthy family in the North or in Europe, was pure, untaxed, untraceable profit. They ceased to be property and became a secret transaction, a soul exchanged for gold. The Catholic Church, the dominant religious authority, also played a complex role. While officially concerned with the souls of the enslaved, the priests often depended on the largesse of the wealthy slave-owning families. Their parish records, intended to document baptisms and burials, would become the first, most terrifying source of evidence in our mystery. A record of disappearances, altered parentage, and suspiciously timed deaths. The language of the city itself, a mixture of French, Spanish, English, and Creole, was the language of obfuscation, allowing rumors to travel in one tongue and legal proceedings to be held in another. Behind the elegant facades and the perfumed air of the Garden District, the great families of New Orleans, the Caldwells, the Tremaines, the De La Houssaye clan, were masters of quiet, brutal commerce. They traded cotton, sugar, and human beings with the same cold detachment, and now they had discovered a darker, more perverse commodity, the sale of white innocence, born out of their own violation and covered by a shroud of immaculate deception. It was a secret they would kill to keep buried beneath the damp, moss-covered graves of the city. The conspiracy, vast and chilling as it was, revolved around specific, powerful players and their voiceless victims. Our investigation narrows on 3 figures whose lives intersected violently across the 1830s and 40s. Amélie Laveau, the laundress, and the ghost. Amélie Laveau was the woman whose quiet defiance first exposed the pattern. She was not the flamboyant, voodoo-practicing Marie Laveau who would become a legend, but a separate, equally compelling figure, a slave woman owned by the Caldwell family, charged with managing the household's laundry operations. Amélie was described in a single, surviving 1841 assessment document as having a lean, strong frame and eyes of deep, unsettling black that missed nothing. Unlike field slaves, Amélie was constantly within the main house, a shadow presence in the most intimate spaces of her owners' lives. She ironed the governor's dress shirts and laundered the fine linens of Mrs. Caldwell's marital bed. She saw the quiet, damning details, the stain of claret spilled on a ledger, the note tucked into a coat pocket, the small, almost imperceptible changes in the household's routines. She possessed an inner world of fierce, unyielding resolve, masked by the requisite meekness of her station. Her greatest fear was not the lash, but the separation from her children, the ultimate weapon of the slave system. Amélie had already given birth to 2 children who were sold down the river, a fate that had hardened her heart into a desperate tactical core. When she conceived her 3rd child, the little girl whose ivory-handled brush was found years later, she knew 2 things instantly. First, the father was John Caldwell, her master, a man of cold, calculating cruelty, whose nighttime visits were always silent and quick. Second, the child, named Therese, was startlingly fair. Amélie knew Caldwell's system. He was known for selling mixed-race children with lighter features, a common, though deeply cynical practice. But Therese was different. Her skin was the color of fresh cream, her eyes pale blue, and her hair that astonishing white gold. She looked utterly, undeniably white. One evening, while folding the master's sheets, Caldwell found her. He paused, his shadow dominating the small room. "The girl." "Therese," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "She's remarkable, a shame." Amélie kept her eyes on the linen. "Yes, monsieur. She is healthy." "Healthy means value," Caldwell replied, running a rough finger over the lace trim of a pillowcase. "I've received an offer, a very generous offer from a northern family. They are looking for an orphan." Amélie froze. She looked up, her black eyes pinning him. "You intend to sell my daughter, monsieur?" Caldwell offered a chillingly benign smile. "No, Amélie. I intend to profit from a beautiful, convenient lie. She won't be sold as my property. She will be delivered as a white orphan. A far cleaner transaction and a much higher price." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "You will be silent. You will mourn privately, and you will be rewarded with a small easing of your duties. Understand?" "I understand, monsieur," Amélie said, the words dust in her mouth. But in her soul, a silent, terrible oath had been sworn. She would not let this child vanish without a trace. She would leave a ghost in the machine. John Caldwell, the legislator and the predator. John Caldwell was not merely a planter. He was a man of civic influence, a state legislator known for his impassioned, if dry, defense of the Southern way of life. His portrait, painted around 1840, shows a man of stern, square features, thinning brown hair neatly combed, and eyes that held the cold, unwavering certainty of entitlement. He saw himself as a pillar of New Orleans society, a man burdened by the responsibility of managing vast assets, human and material. Caldwell's ambition was the driving force behind the systematic white sale. He didn't view the enslaved women as human beings, nor their children as his own progeny. They were raw material. His fear was exposure, the kind of scandal that could destroy his political career and ruin his family's position. His greatest ambition was to parlay his plantation wealth into national political power, perhaps even the Senate. The sale of white-passing babies was a clandestine financial booster, allowing him to expand his land holdings without relying on bank loans, all while maintaining the veneer of a financially conservative, morally upright gentleman. His ledger entries for these particular transactions were meticulous, yet utterly deceptive. They were never recorded in the slave sales column. Instead, they were hidden under property disposition, unspecified assets. One morning, his overseer, a coarse Irishman named Finn, approached him about an issue of parentage. "Monsieur Caldwell," Finn stammered, twisting his hat. "The girl, Elodie, she's birthed another one. But this one, it looks French, monsieur. Pale. Too pale for the usual lot." Caldwell didn't look up from his reading of the congressional record. "Is it healthy?" "Vigorous, sir. But she keeps it hidden. Won't let the others near it. I fear rumor will spread among the hands." Caldwell finally lifted his head, a slow, predatory calculation in his eyes. "Finn, rumors are managed. The girl, Elodie. Tell her the child is too sickly for labor but too fair to be sold. Tell her I will personally arrange for its care and passage out of the quarter. We will call it a charitable adoption. No one speaks of this, Finn. No one is to speak of the fairness of the Caldwell property. Do you understand the value of silence, Finn?" "I understand, monsieur," Finn replied, suddenly sweating. He understood that value perfectly. It was the price of his own job, and perhaps his life. Dr. Philemon Tremaine, the physician and the middleman. The crucial link between the illicit commodity and the unsuspecting buyer was the family physician, Dr. Philemon Tremaine. A man of quiet elegance, educated in Edinburgh, Tremaine possessed a scientific mind hardened by the gruesome realities of 19th-century medicine. He was a trusted confidant to dozens of elite families, a man who entered bedrooms and parlors where no one else dared. Tremaine's professional facade was impeccable, a humanitarian focused on infant mortality and public hygiene. His hidden face was that of a profiteer. He exploited the tragedy of real white infant deaths in his practice. When a wealthy, childless family came to him, heartbroken by the loss of their own newborn, Tremaine would wait, calculating. A few months later, he would arrive with a solution: a beautiful, healthy orphan from an impoverished but decent Creole family who had suffered a private tragedy. His medical network provided the forged birth documents and the quiet transport routes out of the city. Tremaine was driven by the fear of professional ruin, his fear of being exposed for several medical malpractice suits in his past, and a crippling, self-justified greed. He was the architect of the lie, the man who gave the human transaction a medical and legal disguise. In his darkened study, lit only by a sputtering gas lamp, he once argued with Caldwell over the logistics of a particularly difficult transfer, a baby girl named Isabel, who had been born with a distinct birthmark. "The De La Houssaye family in Boston requires a child, John," Tremaine said, nervously polishing his spectacles. "But the mark, the small reddish stain above the left eye, it is too distinct. They are meticulous. It must be addressed." Caldwell scoffed, sipping brandy. "Philemon, you are a doctor. Find a tincture, a salve. Burn it off, if you must. Just ensure the transaction is clean. The price we discussed stands, but the child must be flawless. Do not risk the entire network over a simple birthmark." Tremaine sighed, the glass in his hand trembling slightly. "It is not the mark I fear, John. It is the ledger. It is God. I am merely concerned with the optics of the situation." "God," Caldwell muttered dismissively, "is a silent partner in this city, Philemon. Optics are everything." The stage was set, the resourceful victim leaving a trail, the predator driven by power, and the calculating middleman using science to mask a sin. The horror was not supernatural. It was bureaucratic, economic, and fundamentally human. The vast conspiracy of the Vente Blanche was built upon two fragile principles: silence and secrecy. But in a city as humid and dense with gossip as New Orleans, silence is merely a temporary condition, and secrecy always decays into suspicion. The first signs that something profoundly unnatural was happening began not with a grand revelation, but with small, unsettling omissions, like misplaced notes in a chord. The dread began to accumulate in three distinct spheres: among the enslaved population, within the parish records of the local church, and in the anxious, competitive parlors of the white aristocracy. The fear in the quarters. Among the enslaved people, the disappearance of a child was tragically common, but the disappearance of the white-looking child was unique. It was often accompanied by a temporary, unsettling ease of the mother's burden, a new dress, lighter chores, perhaps even a reprieve from the whip for a few months. This unexpected kindness felt less like charity and more like a payout for silence. Amélie Laveau, after the sale of Therese, found herself elevated to the status of a cautionary figure. The other slave women whispered about her. They saw her cold, contained grief, and the new hard glint of tactical survival in her eyes. One night, near the communal washtub, Amélie was approached by Marie, a young cook whose own fair-skinned baby boy, Pierre, had vanished 6 months prior. Marie was frail, her spirit broken by the loss. "Amélie," Marie whispered, scrubbing fiercely at a chemise. "Is it true what they say?" "Monsieur Caldwell, did he give you laniape for the sale, a better blanket, a new bucket?" Amélie paused her work, the soap suds thick on her hands. She looked directly at Marie. "He gave me quiet, Marie, a few months of quiet to plan. That's all a master gives you for your child, a moment to breathe before the next one." Marie trembled. "But where do they go, Amélie? My Pierre, he had my mother's eyes. They were gray, like the river silt. They said he was too sick. They buried a small, nameless box, but I saw the earth. It wasn't disturbed enough. He is not in the ground, Amélie. I feel it." Amélie returned to her work. "He is not in the ground, Marie. He is in Boston or New York. He is on a fine carpet with a name that is not yours. They sell their sins as orphans, Marie. They sell their property as white. The paper says one thing. Your heart knows the truth." This was the core of the rumor. The children were not dying. They were vanishing into the white world. The Mères de la Lune, the mothers of the moon, as the slave women began to call them, knew the truth of their children's features. They began documenting in secret, whispered genealogies, the details of the vanished, a specific freckle, a birthmark, a peculiar habit. Amélie was collecting these fragments, turning ephemeral sorrow into hard evidence. The omissions in the parish register. The second layer of suspicion emerged from the cold, objective records of the church. Father Louis d'Aubigné of St. Louis Cathedral was an aging, meticulous priest. He took the recording of baptisms and burials with grave seriousness, seeing them as not just civic duties, but as sacred acts of soul accounting. Over the course of 3 years, Father d'Aubigné noticed an anomaly in the Caldwell records and those of a handful of allied families, the Tremaines, the de la Houssaye family, who were connected to the legislature. There was an unusually high number of stillbirths and infant burials, unnamed, listed for the slave quarters. This was tragic, but not unheard of. What was unusual was the pattern of documentation for the master's legitimate families. Father, his young, ambitious assistant, Brother Antoine, pointed out one gloomy afternoon, tracing a finger down the ledger for 1836. "Look here. Madame Caldwell recorded the birth and immediate death of a male infant, Charles, in May. The burial receipt is signed by Dr. Tremaine. Yet, just 2 months prior, there is a paid mass for a successful delivery in the same household, unspecified, but a significant donation." Father d'Aubigné adjusted his spectacles, his brow furrowing over the dense Latin script. "The records are often confusing, brother. Slave births are noted separately, as property acquisition." "Yes, Father, but this is different. In 4 separate cases across these 3 families, a slave woman gave birth to a child whose features were described by the midwife as every fair, almost immediately followed by a stillbirth or illness notice. And in 3 of those cases, within 6 months, Dr. Tremaine oversaw the private baptism and subsequent placement of an entirely unrelated orphaned white child into a prominent family, often in another state. There is no accounting for the white child's parentage, Father. No earthly lineage is recorded." The implications were devastating. Dr. Tremaine was using the legitimate death certificates of the Caldwell children, or perhaps faking them, to create documentary space for the sold slave children. The high donation for successful delivery was the payoff to the midwife for her silence. The church records were not just recording history, they were being used to erase it. Father d'Aubigné looked at the entries, his hand trembling slightly. He saw not ledgers, but a paper trail of souls being systematically trafficked. "Brother Antoine," he whispered, "if this is true, we are looking at something far worse than simple cruelty. We are looking at a deception against God's own laws of creation. These men are trading in human souls, using the church as their curtain. Find me the original midwife's records. We must compare the signatures. The anxiety of the aristocracy. The final and most volatile source of suspicion came from the very class that profited from slavery. The white aristocracy, particularly the wives of the wealthy planters, lived in a constant state of social scrutiny, obsessed with purity of bloodline and the maintenance of their status. They noticed the quiet, cold detachment of men like Caldwell towards their own children, contrasted by their intense, secret financial dealings. They observed the strange trips to Natchez or Charleston, ostensibly for business, but always coinciding with the rumors of a vanishing baby. Mrs. Alara Caldwell, John Caldwell's wife, was the quintessential woman of her class, proud, devout, and terrifyingly aware of social nuance. She had her own private source of dread, the unsettling physical features of her husband's legitimate children. None of them carried the same startlingly pale features of the slave children Amélie had described. Mrs. Caldwell was deeply suspicious of her husband's associate, Dr. Tremaine, whom she considered pretentious. She cornered the doctor at a society gala one evening, her smile icy. "Dr. Tremaine," she purred, accepting a glass of champagne. "Tell me, your charity work with the unfortunate orphans of the North. It is so commendable. But I have always wondered, these children you place, the ones who are so remarkably fair and perfectly formed, where precisely do you find such flawless poverty? Our city is full of hungry, dark-eyed street waifs. Yours seem imported." Tremaine's hand tightened perceptibly on his glass. He managed a professional chuckle. "Mrs. Caldwell, you wound me. I assure you, lineage is secondary to health and a good Christian upbringing. We are simply blessed with finding the most robust infants." "Robust indeed," Mrs. Caldwell murmured, her eyes holding his. "I have always believed that robust trees grow from the strongest roots. But then again, Doctor, perhaps I simply misunderstand botany." The subtle implication was clear. Mrs. Caldwell suspected a financial arrangement, but perhaps not the full, horrifying truth. Yet her aristocratic certainty, fueled by suspicion and jealousy, was another crack in the conspirators' facade. The silence was beginning to fracture, replaced by the rising hum of institutional anxiety. The pressure on John Caldwell and Dr. Philemon Tremaine was mounting, not from a single organized investigation, but from the slow, insidious accretion of facts observed by the disenfranchised. Amélie's silence was a weapon. Father Dalbin's meticulousness was a snare, and Mrs. Caldwell's aristocratic spite was an eroding force. The town's fear of the unseen was morphing into the suspicion of the all-too-visible powerful. The midwife's testimony and the doctor's fear. The most direct threat to the conspiracy materialized in the form of Mademoiselle Eliana. She was a respected older Creole midwife who served both the main houses and the quarters for several influential families, including the Caldwells. She was paid handsomely to deliver the enslaved children and, crucially, to maintain meticulous records of their physical appearance for the owner, details that confirmed the potential labor value of the child. When the white-passing infants were born, Caldwell and Tremaine paid her an enormous additional sum for a second, fraudulent document, a certificate of stillbirth. Father d'Aubigne, guided by the unsettling pattern in his own baptismal records, sought her out under the pretense of a charity inventory. He found Eliana sitting in her small cottage near the swamp, nursing a deep, gnawing fear. She was wealthy, but terrified. She possessed the physical proof of the crime. Father d'Aubigne, knowing he could not directly accuse, spoke in veiled theological terms. "Eliana, my dear," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "when we stand before God, we must account for the true number of souls we have witnessed enter this world. The Lord forgives the necessary lies of survival, but the lie that corrupts the very lineage, the lie that turns a person into a mere receipt of gold, that is a sin of commission. Eliana stared at the fire, her eyes wet. Father, the gold is heavy. It keeps my grandchildren safe. But the light, it burns my hands. I delivered the child of Amélie Laveau, a perfect girl. White, Father. I swear before the cross, she was fairer than Madame Caldwell's own children. Monsieur Caldwell held the baby for scarcely a minute, not with affection, but with the expression of a man counting barrels of rum. He said, "The property is pristine. Prepare the paperwork for the disposal." So, she went to a trunk and pulled out a rolled parchment, the very record Father Daubin had been looking for. This is the true record. I kept it separate from the paperwork Dr. Tremaine provided. He forced me to sign a document stating the child was deceased upon arrival, cause unspecified. But the truth is here. She pointed to a small, specific note in the margin written in tiny, elegant French script. Né avec une petite tache de rousseur sous l'oreille droite, couleur de cheveux or blanc. Born with a small freckle beneath the right ear, hair color white gold. This was the smoking gun, a documented physical feature of the sold child, known only to the midwife and Amélie, which could be verified against the orphan wherever that she had been placed. The journalist's instinct. The mounting anxiety also drew the attention of the secular world. In the newsroom of the New Orleans Picayune, a young, ambitious investigative journalist named Marcus DeVries noticed the suspicious influx of cash among certain legislators like Caldwell, coupled with their curiously restrained real estate expansions. They were suddenly richer than their cotton yield suggested, but they weren't spending locally. DeVries began an investigation into the city's adoption and charity networks, a labyrinth of opaque transactions often managed by Dr. Tremaine's private foundation. He was looking for evidence of fraud or embezzlement, but he stumbled onto something far more disturbing. He found a series of letters between Tremaine and a brokerage house in Boston. The letters discussed the transfer of high-value goods and the delivery of a specially requested shipment of Louisiana lace and porcelain dolls. The language was coded, but the transfer amounts were enormous. DeVries confronted Tremaine at a dockside cafe, pretending to investigate a totally different political scandal. "Doctor," DeVries began, his tone light and conspiratorial, "I'm looking into the import taxes on luxury goods. I noted a shipment you received from Boston. Very curious. A large amount of money was paid for, what was it, dolls and lace? Yet the manifest listed only medical supplies." Tremaine's composure cracked just slightly. He dabbed his mouth with a napkin, his eyes darting. "Mr. DeVries, my practice requires specific imported European supplies. The manifest may be a clerical error. It is a matter of no civic import." "No civic import?" DeVries pressed. "But the invoice from the Boston broker mentioned white gold goods. I am merely trying to understand what luxury commodity could be so rare, so valuable, and yet so easily misclassified as medical supplies. Is this a tax dodge, Doctor, or something more personal? Perhaps something pertaining to the true commerce of this city?" Tremaine leaned over the table, his earlier composure entirely gone, replaced by naked menace. "Young man, this city runs on discretion. You are treading on ground that has been settled by fortunes far older and heavier than your newspaper subscription base. I suggest you report on the weather, or perhaps the governor's new policies. Dig into the private holdings of the Caldwells, and you will find your career, and perhaps your life, very quickly rendered obsolete." The threat was clear. The crime was protected at the highest level. DeVries had stumbled onto the dark heart of the conspiracy. It was not simple financial fraud. It was a trade in human beings, disguised by the language of commerce and the sanctity of medicine. The psychological toll, Amélie's defiance. Meanwhile, Amélie Laveau was enacting her quiet, terrifying campaign of remembrance. She had risked her life to embed the small, ivory-handled brush with the initials AL near the spot where her baby, Thérèse, was symbolically buried. Now she began to spread the specific, verifiable details of her child's appearance among the other Mères de la Lune. She used her position as the laundress, a source of constant, intimate gossip and information exchange, to plant seeds of recognition. She didn't speak the full truth aloud, but she spoke in riddles and haunting specificity. The master's cousin, Madame de la Houssaye, she sent a letter from Charleston, Amélie told the others while kneading dough in the Caldwell kitchen. It spoke of a baby girl, an orphan they adopted, a beautiful child, and she described the child's small, perfectly circular birthmark. The mark, she said, was like a drop of old French claret right beneath the ear. Every woman who heard this specific detail, and there were 3 other mothers whose infants had vanished with the same mark, felt a bolt of horror and recognition. They realized Amélie was providing them with a verifiable identification tag for their sold children. They began to understand that the master's shame was their children's secret identity. This subtle psychological resistance was the most corrosive element of the entire conspiracy. The enslaved women were transforming themselves from passive victims into active witnesses, ensuring that if any of these orphans ever returned to New Orleans or were discovered by accident, the truth of their parentage would be known. Caldwell and Tremaine had focused on legal and financial cover-ups, neglecting the fierce, enduring memory of a mother's love. They were selling property, but Amélie was tracking souls. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. The conspiracy was approaching its breaking point. The combined pressure of Father Delbigne's moral investigation, DeVries' journalistic skepticism, and Amélie's subterranean network of evidence was forcing the conspirators to take drastic and ultimately self-destructive measures. The climax of this horror was not a public confrontation, but a quiet, terrifying discovery within the sanctity of the Caldwell estate. The priest's quiet threat. Father Delbigne, now armed with Mademoiselle Eliana's true ledger and the documented physical markers of the sold children, realized he possessed evidence of a crime that transcended mere slave trading. It was systematic fraud against the state and a profound theological sin. However, he also knew that confronting John Caldwell directly, a man of such political influence, would result in the immediate suppression of the evidence and possibly Eliana's murder. He chose a different strategy: spiritual warfare. Father Delbigne visited Caldwell's estate, not as an accuser, but as a shepherd concerned for his flock's soul. He found Caldwell in his study, surrounded by papers and port. "John," the priest said gently, refusing the offer of a chair, "I am here about your soul's reckoning. The whispers in the quarter, the stories of children who vanish and reappear under different names. They have reached the confessional, and the confessional, John, demands truth." Caldwell stiffened. "Father, I am a law-abiding man. My financial dealings are transparent, and my treatment of my property is according to the law of Louisiana." "The law of man is one thing," Delbigne pressed, stepping closer to the massive oak desk. "But the law of the Lord demands we do not bear false witness, nor traffic in souls as if they were livestock. I have seen the records, John, the discrepancies between the children born and the children accounted for. You have created a paper-thin veil of deception, and I fear that beneath it lies not just profit, but damnation." He paused, letting his gaze fall heavily on Caldwell. "I do not seek to condemn you to the state, John. I seek to save your immortal soul. Tell me where the children are. Give me their true identities. Allow me to amend the parish register before it is too late. Otherwise, when you pass, I will be compelled to record the truth of your great sin in the permanent archives for all eternity." This was the gut punch, the threat of eternal public shame. To Caldwell, a man obsessed with legacy and reputation, the idea of being forever recorded by the church as a trafficker of his own children was worse than prison. It was a threat against the very immortality he sought to secure through his political machinations. Caldwell exploded in a low, furious roar. "Get out of my house, Father. You overstep your authority. You preach charity while digging for scandal. I'm not confessing to your church, and I'm certainly not amending my ledgers for your sanctimonious threats. I will have your bishop informed of your interference by morning." D'Aubigny left calmly, but his threat had achieved its goal. He had injected a paralyzing fear into Caldwell's mind. The night of the ledger. Caldwell, unnerved and paranoid, rushed to solidify his cover. The central piece of evidence was his main plantation ledger, the financial heart of his operation, where the illicit sales were concealed within pages of legitimate cotton and sugar transactions. The entries, however coded, could not withstand genuine scrutiny. He decided to destroy it. The evening was suffocatingly hot, the air still and heavy, promising a violent storm. Caldwell dismissed the house staff early, telling them to return to the quarters. He went to his study, pulled the massive leather-bound ledger from his safe, and placed it on his desk. He prepared to burn it in the fireplace. But he was being watched. Amélie Laveau, the ghost in the house, had noticed the unusual dismissal of the staff and the lingering scent of brandy and fear coming from the study. She knew, with chilling certainty, what Caldwell was about to destroy. It was her only chance. She slipped back into the house, a shadow moving through the long, darkened corridors. She knew the study's layout intimately. She polished the desk, she cleaned the fireplace. She paused outside the door, hearing the dry scratch of a match and the sound of paper crinkling. Caldwell was beginning the destruction. Amélie moved silently, using the same ingrained deference she had been forced to maintain for 20 years. She did not enter through the main door. She went to the thin, decorative casement window behind the desk, which opened into the garden. As Caldwell struggled to light the thick, glued-down pages of the ledger, Amélie slid the window open just enough to see. Caldwell succeeded in lighting the corner of the heavy book. The flame struggled, then caught. He stepped back, watching his great sin turn to ash. It was in that moment, in the terrible glow of the consuming fire, that Amélie saw it. The coded entries. Caldwell, in his paranoia, had used a secondary, hidden code. Next to the cryptic entries like disposed asset, lace, $1,800, he had made tiny, near-invisible marks in fading red ink. Amélie, who had watched him sign bills and pay slips for years, knew that Caldwell sometimes used a specific, personalized annotation for transactions involving his own kin or specific high-risk deals. The red marks were placed right next to the sale column for the disappeared children. Driven by a desperation that overcame all fear, Amélie threw a heavy, ornamental doorstop through the window. The shattering glass was deafening. Caldwell cried out, stumbling back from the fire, momentarily blinded by the flying shards and the shock. The ledger, still burning in the fireplace, had not been completely consumed. Amélie turned and fled, not toward the house quarters, but into the darkness of the city. She had not secured the physical ledger, but she had secured the key to the code and confirmation of its location. The blinding revelation. The sound of the shattering glass and Caldwell's furious shouts alerted the nearest neighbor, a retired judge. The judge called the city police. When the constables arrived, they found Caldwell in a rage, nursing a superficial cut, the smell of burnt leather heavy in the air. The main ledger was retrieved, partially burned but intact enough to be readable. The investigators, now galvanized by De Vries's constant pressure and Father d'Aubigny's formal complaint, filed immediately after his confrontation with Caldwell, focused on the coded entries. The ledger, titled Caldwell Plantation, Annual Yields and Acquisitions, seemed to document the sale of cotton, sugar, and slaves. But when the investigators cross-referenced the cryptic, high-value Unspecified Assets, with the red ink markings and the information supplied by Father D'Albigne from Mamselle Eliana's notes, the chilling truth was unveiled. The red marks were Caldwell's personal shorthand for BCF, bloodline confirmed. The unspecified assets were not commodities. They were his own white-passing biological children, sold north. The ledger revealed not just a crime, but a calculated system. The entries mapped out the transfer of over 20 infants between 1832 and 1845, each one paired with a coded transaction and a suspiciously timed orphan placement handled by Dr. Tremaine. The scale of the horror was immediate and sickening. It was not a handful of isolated sins, it was a factory of deception, turning slave women's forced births into pure white profit. The investigators had expected fraud. They had expected cruel trading. They had not expected this precise clinical documentation of the systematic denial of parentage and the trafficking of children based on the very hue of their skin. It was a commerce so vile it seemed to devour the very soul of the city's elite. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. The revelation of the bloodline-confirmed ledger sent a tremor of horror and indignation through New Orleans that rippled far beyond the confines of the French Quarter. The initial shock quickly crystallized into one of the most racially charged and socially sensitive trials of the antebellum South. The arrest and the trial of John Caldwell. John Caldwell was arrested not on the charge of cruelty to slaves, a charge that often went unpunished, but on the politically volatile charges of systematic mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud wealthy citizens of the North, and the forgery of official state and parish documents. The state was careful to frame the crime in terms of property rights and financial corruption rather than humanitarian outrage, making the case palatable to the powerful slaveholding judiciary. The arrest itself was a spectacle. Caldwell, shackled and stripped of his legislative dignity, maintained an air of entitled denial. "This is a fabrication of my political enemies," he declared to the crowd that gathered outside his manor. "A vile abolitionist lie aimed at destabilizing the very fabric of Southern commerce." The trial became a national sensation. Journalists like Marcus de Vries of the Picayune detailed every gruesome entry of the ledger, coining the term white gold for the children involved. The courtroom proceedings highlighted the grotesque mechanics of the trade. The midwife's testimony. Mamselle Eliana, protected by Father D'Albigne, delivered her testimony with chilling clarity, describing the features of the infants, the forced signature on the false stillbirth certificates, and the enormous cash payments. She became the face of the witnesses. The church's evidence. Father D'Albigne presented the original, unaltered parish records against the false certificates provided by Dr. Tremaine, demonstrating the coordinated use of the church's authority to create legal, white identities for the infants. Amélie Laveau's silent power. Amélie was not permitted to testify. Her testimony as an enslaved person against a white man was inadmissible. However, her simple physical presence in the courtroom, coupled with the details released by de Vries about the ivory brush and the golden hair, became a silent, powerful indictment. She represented the memory that the state's legal system sought to deny. Dr. Philemon Tremaine, the architect of the fraud, proved to be the weak link. Fearful of hanging, he turned state's evidence, detailing how the network operated, identifying the wealthy northern families who were unwitting buyers, and confirming the BCF code. He confessed that his motive was purely financial, a desperate need to cover old debts and maintain his status. The verdict and the societal fracture. The jury, composed entirely of white planters and merchants, struggled. The evidence of fraud was undeniable, but the implications were horrifying. To convict Caldwell was to admit that their own class had willingly and systematically blurred the definitive line of race for profit, making a mockery of the very purity laws they cherished. In a compromise that shocked the North but satisfied the Southern elite, Caldwell was found guilty of forgery and grand fraud, but not guilty of any charge related to the illegal trafficking of human beings. The court classified the white gold transactions as a fraudulent sale of valuable chattel, property passed off under false pretenses, rather than the kidnapping and sale of white children, which would have meant the death penalty. He was sentenced to 10 years in a Louisiana prison, a term viewed as a political necessity to preserve the appearance of order. Dr. Tremaine, for his cooperation, received a mere 3-year sentence. The legal consequence was minor, but the societal impact was catastrophic. The crisis of lineage. The trial ignited an immediate, terrifying crisis among the white aristocracy. If Caldwell, a pillar of society, could use his own mixed-race children to defraud other white families, then the purity of all Southern and Northern lineages was suspect. Wives questioned their husbands. Legitimate children questioned their own parentage. The fear was simple. If a child could be sold as white, how many existing white citizens were unknowingly of African descent? The black market of memory. The trial failed to locate or notify the 20-plus families who had purchased the orphans. The court, unwilling to trigger a national race scandal, quietly suppressed all identifying documents. The state's official position was that the children, now fully integrated into white society, were legally and socially white, and their original identity was unknowable and irrelevant. This left Amélie Laveau's network of mothers as the only repository of the truth, passing down the descriptions, the freckle, the eye color, the birthmark, as a kind of secret, heartbreaking genealogy. The rise of hardened racism. Ironically, the exposure of the Vente Blanche did not lead to abolitionist reform. Instead, it contributed to a hardening of racial attitudes. Fearful that the line between white and black was far too easy to cross, Southern legislatures swiftly moved to tighten color line laws, making definitions of race more rigid and increasing penalties for any interaction that blurred the boundary. The horror of the deception led to a desperate, aggressive reassertion of white supremacy to prevent any future exploitation of the profitable, terrifying ambiguity of color. 9. The story of the Immaculate Deception was eventually buried beneath the greater cataclysms of the Civil War, remembered only in hushed tones and in the occasional unnerving appearance of a strangely fair child in a Southern family line. The fear was that the crime had never truly ended. It had merely dissolved into the very bloodstream of the nation. The New Orleans story of the Immaculate Deception did not end with the judge's gavel or the prison door closing on John Caldwell. It ended with the silence of the sold. Imagine the children, Thérèse Laveau, Pierre, Isabelle, and the 17 others. They grew up in affluent homes in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, raised with every advantage of a privileged white life. They were educated, attended grand churches, and were taught the history of America through the lens of their adopted false identity. They never knew the smell of the Louisiana swamp or the deep guttural sound of the slave quarters' night drums. They were taught to scorn the very lineage that gave them life. The horror is not merely the crime that was committed, but the eternal, unknowable consequence. How many of these individuals went on to marry into prominent Northern abolitionist families, fighting the very system that created them? How many, unknowingly, inherited the cold eyes or the calculating ambition of their father, John Caldwell? Their lives became the ultimate horrifying secret woven into the American tapestry, a truth hidden in plain sight carried in the bone and blood of the nation's elite. The white-passing children were the invisible, forced integration of the races, a perverse form of reconciliation born not of love or justice, but of brutal, clinical profit. The true victims were the Mères de la Lune, the mothers who carried the secret in their memory. Amélie Laveau vanished from the records entirely shortly after the trial, possibly sold to a distant plantation, or perhaps having fulfilled her terrible duty, She managed to find a freedom that was not recorded in any white man's ledger. But her act of defiance, the ivory brush, the recorded specifics of a freckle or an eye color, ensured that the truth remained a haunting potentiality. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or was it buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. I will now resume the narrative at the point where the escalation suspicion section ended, and then expand the revelation climax of horror section to meet the target word count. Resumption. Point. Escalation suspicion. This content is integrated directly after the last line of the previous section 4. What do you think, guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. The weight of silence. A deepening dread. The city of New Orleans, already a hotbed of paranoia concerning bloodline and social boundaries, began to buckle under the strain of the unsaid. Caldwell, Tremaine, and their minor associates maintained a public front of unflappable respectability, but their actions became increasingly erratic, fueled by the three-pronged threat they faced: the moral authority of the church, the penetrating gaze of the press, and the tactical memory of the enslaved. The Tremaine Network and the Paper Trail. Dr. Tremaine, though outwardly calm, was frantically trying to cover the medical tracks. His system relied on a network of midwives and, critically, a specific clerk at the city hall who handled the registration of orphans and interstate transfers. This clerk, a nervous, middle-aged man named Horace Dubuisson, suddenly began taking extended, unexplained leaves of absence. Marcus de Vries, the young journalist, smelled blood. He knew the money trail led through Tremaine's charity for foundling infants, a legitimate organization that acted as the perfect shell for the Vente Blanche. De Vries spent weeks in the sweltering, dust-choked basements of the city archives, cross-referencing death certificates with the orphan transfers. He discovered that every time a slave mother gave birth to a very fair child, as per Mamselle Eliana's whispered reports, 2 seemingly unrelated events occurred within a 6-month window. A white family, often poor immigrants, would register an infant death, which Tremaine would certify. A transfer would be made to an out-of-state charity or family for a perfectly healthy, unrelated orphan, certified by Horace Dubuisson. De Vries realized the monstrous efficiency of the system. Tremaine wasn't just faking records. He was co-opting the genuine tragedy of white infant mortality to provide believable legal documentation for the trafficked children. A death certificate for a poor, forgotten white baby became the cover for the life of a rich-looking, highly priced slave baby. De Vries, armed with these contradictory records, confronted Horace Dubuisson at his local saloon. "Mr. Dubuisson," De Vries said, sliding a folded copy of 2 contradictory certificates across the bar, one showing an infant's death in May, the other showing an orphan transfer in July, both signed by the same notary. These names, they are similar, are they not? Too similar for coincidence. I believe Dr. Tremaine is defrauding the city. He is using these deaths to create fraudulent identities for tax purposes. A simple clerical error, perhaps, or something more serious. I would hate to see you implicated in a fraud case. Dubuisson's face went white beneath his sweat. He didn't look at the papers. He looked only at the swinging door, his eyes wide with paralyzing fear. "Mr. De Vries, you misunderstand the work here. The paperwork. It is complex. Dr. Tremaine is a pillar of the community. I assure you, I sign only what the doctor provides. He handles the details of the lineage. My responsibility is the stamp and the seal. Nothing more." "The lineage," De Vries repeated, leaning in. "But what if the lineage is the very thing being sold? What if the paper you sign says the child is white, but the ledger says the mother is property? That is not fraud, Mr. Dubuisson. That is a crime of a different, deeper magnitude. Tell me about the red marks. Tremaine has been marking some of these transfer sheets in red ink. What does the red mean?" Dubuisson slammed his fist onto the bar, rattling the glasses. "I said, nothing more. Leave me alone. I have a family. You do not understand the power you are provoking." He stumbled out, leaving his drink untouched, confirming de Vries's suspicion that the paper trail was hot, and that the conspirators were now fracturing under fear. Mrs. Caldwell's quiet vengeance. Meanwhile, inside the Caldwell home, the atmosphere was poisonous. Mrs. Alara Caldwell, driven by her suspicion of Tremaine and her deep, festering jealousy over her husband's repeated infidelities with the enslaved women, became a mole within her own mansion. She didn't care about the welfare of the children. She cared about the integrity of her name and the purity of her husband's property. She had noticed that whenever Caldwell was preparing for one of the unspecified asset dispositions, he would spend hours in his study, locking himself in with his large, leather-bound financial ledger. She knew the secret was in that book. Mrs. Caldwell began her slow, aristocratic siege. She started asking her husband seemingly innocuous questions at dinner, focusing on the details of his business partners and his properties. One evening, while discussing the sugar crop, she asked, "John, darling, your ledgers are so comprehensive. You track every ounce of cane, but I've noticed you use that peculiar red ink sometimes. You only use that for family letters. Is there a sentimental attachment to some of your cotton shipments, or is it a new accounting trick to avoid the tax man?" Caldwell looked up from his plate, his eyes like chipped ice. "Elara, my business is not your concern. The red ink is a simple tracking symbol for high-risk exports. Do not speak of it again." High risk, you say," she mused, cutting her meat with surgical precision. "I always thought the highest risk in this city, John, was mistaking one kind of property for another. Or perhaps simply mistaking a man for a gentleman." Her venom was controlled, yet devastating. Caldwell realized his wife suspected far more than she let on. He knew she had the access to destroy him, not through law, but through social ruin. Her surveillance and passive aggression hastened his decision to burn the ledger, fearing her exposure more than the external threats. Her aristocratic desire for vengeance was an unacknowledged tool of justice. Expansion, revelation, climax of horror. This content is integrated directly after the previous Section 5, before the description of the aftermath of the discovery. The fire and the confession. The night Caldwell attempted to burn his ledger, the night Amélie Laveau threw the doorstop through the window, was the pivot point. The shattering glass was the sound of the conspiracy breaking. When the constables left, having secured the partially burned ledger and taking Caldwell into temporary custody pending investigation, the mansion was sealed. The damaged ledger, still reeking of smoke and fear, was taken to the police superintendent's office. The key to the entire case was now visible, but still locked away by code. Breaking the BCF code. Superintendent Levesque, a man of limited imagination but an eye for detail, was initially stymied. He saw columns of numbers, vague labels, and the consistent high-value transfers. He also saw the peculiar red annotations, the BCF, marks that Caldwell had used as his personal cross-reference. N. de Vries, granted limited access to the evidence due to the public interest his reporting had generated, was allowed to examine the papers with an official notary. He immediately recognized the red marks, recalling Mrs. Caldwell's cryptic comment. "Superintendent," de Vries insisted, tapping the red mark next to an entry for unspecified asset silver hair, valued at $1,900. "Caldwell has a specific hand for this red ink. It is not an accounting code. It is personal. Look here on the very next page, detailing the sale of a prime cotton field. There is a small red X mark. I believe these marks are a cross-reference to a private hidden record, perhaps his own family records, or a separate inventory of high-value items." The breakthrough came hours later when a frantic Brother Antoine from St. Louis Cathedral arrived with Father Daubin's full, organized file. The file included Eliana, the midwife's authenticated records, detailing the birth of the specific children, their features, and the date they vanished. They compared the dates. Caldwell Ledger. Entry, August 1835. Asset, silver hair. Red mark BCF. Value $1,900. Midwife record, August 1835. Child of Amélie Laveau. Born with pale skin, white gold hair. Vanished August 25th. Tremaine transfer record, confiscated. September 1835. Transfer of orphan, age 4 months, to Massachusetts. The puzzle pieces clicked into a horrific mosaic. The red BCF did not stand for bloodline confirmed in Caldwell's mind. It stood for Bastard Confidential File. It was his personal way of flagging the transactions that involved his own illegitimate white-passing children. He marked them to ensure that, no matter where they were sold, he retained a confidential physical accounting of his investment and his biological link, a twisted, proprietary pride. The depth of the deception, theological and occult echoes. The revelation of the BCF code confirmed the criminal conspiracy, but it was Father d'Aubigny who added the final, chilling layer of interpretation, elevating the crime into a theological and moral terror. He articulated the core horror to Superintendent Levesque. This is not merely the selling of property for profit. This is the commercialization of the incarnation. The Catholic understanding of the soul is tied to lineage and baptism. By altering the birthright and the identity of these children, Caldwell and Tremaine sought to erase their divine inheritance and their true, earthly parents. They committed a perfect act of theological theft. The priest saw the operation as an inversion of Christian principles. The enslaved women, often forced into relations, became unwilling participants in a dark parody of the Immaculate Conception, giving birth to children of striking purity who were then immediately stripped of their true parentage and sold into a false, pure, white identity. Caldwell used the language of commerce to mask an act of occult dimension, d'Aubigny stated. He offered these children as a sacrifice to the god of commerce, turning his own sins of the flesh into financial assets, and transferring his shame onto the unsuspecting buyers. He erased the mark of the slave and imposed the mark of the lie. He was trading in innocence, and his ledger is a black mass disguised as an account book. The comparison, crime versus sacrifice, struck a deep chord in the superstitious city. The idea that powerful men were involved in a transaction so profoundly evil that it inverted sacred truths resonated with New Orleans' deep-seated fear of gris-gris and occult corruption. The horror was now not just economic, it was spiritual. Dr. Tremaine's collapse. When the BCF code was broken and the full extent of the 23 documented cases was revealed, Dr. Tremaine was brought in for intense questioning. The physical evidence, the forged death certificates, the coded ledger, the midwife's testimony, was irrefutable. A2. Tremaine, a man who prided himself on his intellectual control, finally broke. He didn't weep. He collapsed into a fit of cold, intellectual rationalization. "It was necessary," Tremaine shrieked, slamming his hands onto the interrogation table. "Caldwell brought me the product, flawless, white. The Southern system, Superintendent, is predicated on the appearance of purity. These children, biologically, were an anomaly, an opportunity. I simply streamlined the delivery of a superior asset to a market that demanded it. We were providing childless families with happiness and giving these children who would have been slaves a chance at a free, rich life." "A free, rich lie," the superintendent corrected him coldly. "A necessary lie," Tremaine insisted, his voice cracking with self-pity. "I protected them from the quarters. I gave them silk and schooling instead of cotton and the whip. I am not a criminal. I am a rationalizer of resources. Caldwell gave me the means, and I provided the mechanism. The North got their pristine orphans, Caldwell got his expansion capital. and the children avoided the degradation of slavery. Where is the true victim in this exchange? The victim, De Vries, who was observing the interrogation, finally spoke up, his voice heavy with moral disgust. Is the soul, doctor. You took the identity of the child and sold it. You made their very existence a transaction, erasing their mother's agony and their father's sin with a forgery. You created 23 walking ghosts, living a stolen life. And that is a unique kind of horror. Tremaine fell silent, his face slack. He began to cooperate fully, driven by the realization that his carefully constructed legacy of scientific respectability was now defined solely by the BCF Code. His subsequent confession detailing the routes, the brokers, and the payoff schedules would form the legal basis for the state's case against Caldwell. The depth of the horror was now fully exposed, reaching into high society across the entire nation. The trial's immediate aftermath was a period of intense, public soul-searching, swiftly followed by a systematic, aggressive effort to suppress the full implications of the scandal. The state, having secured a conviction for financial fraud, was intent on closing the book on the racial and humanitarian dimensions of the Vente Blanche. The suppression of evidence and the price of Northern silence. The most critical and devastating decision made by the Louisiana judicial system was the complete suppression of the buyer registry. Tremaine's confession had provided a list of 23 families in 5 northern states and 2 in Paris who had purchased the orphans to protect the national peace and avoid implicating powerful northern abolitionist and political families in the illegal trade of human beings. However, unwittingly, the judge ruled that releasing the buyer list was a threat to the peace and security of the nation, and ordered the records sealed indefinitely. De Vries, the journalist, fought this ruling fiercely, writing editorials that thundered against the hypocrisy. The court has decreed that the money is dirty, but the children are clean. It has declared that the financial crime must be punished, but the moral terror, the kidnapping and identity theft of the 23 souls, must be buried. We have punished the seller for his greed, but we have granted the powerful buyer absolute anonymity and absolution. This is not justice. It is the highest form of societal self-preservation. The truth has been sacrificed on the altar of the status quo. The suppression meant the children would never know the truth. They would continue to live their lives based on forged paperwork and a doctor's lie. The tragedy was compounded. The mothers were denied closure, and the children were denied reality. Amélie's final act and the secret history. Amélie Laveau, the woman who had risked everything to leave a verifiable trail, found her true freedom not through the courts, but through her own network. The money Caldwell had given her for silence was used to purchase a freedom certificate for herself and her youngest surviving child, not Therese, who was sold, but a subsequent child of darker complexion. Before she vanished, she conducted a final, critical meeting with the other Mères de la Lune, the mothers of the lost pale children. She compiled a final, comprehensive list of the verifiable markers. Therese, Amélie's daughter, white gold hair, small circular freckle beneath the right ear. Pierre, Marie's son, gray eyes like river silt, and a tendency to stutter when nervous. Isabelle, Elodie's daughter, the distinct reddish birthmark above the left eye, as Tremaine had noted. This was the creation of a shadow genealogy. Amélie's instruction was simple. These details must never be written down. They must be memorized and passed down verbally, only to trusted women. If ever a fair-skinned traveler from the north, perhaps a young soldier or a merchant's daughter, arrived in New Orleans bearing one of these specific, non-replicable marks, the women would know. They could never reveal the truth, but they could know the truth, ensuring the horror was not entirely erased. This secret oral tradition became a source of quiet, enduring strength for the enslaved community. It provided a powerful psychological counter-narrative. Their masters might own their bodies and their time, but they could not erase the truth of their kinship. The knowledge was the ultimate, unpurchasable property. The legacies of the conspirators. Caldwell's legacy was one of public humiliation but economic survival. His family managed to hold on to the vast majority of their assets during his decade in prison. He was released a broken man, socially ostracized but financially intact, a testament to the fact that in the antebellum South, the laws of commerce often superseded the laws of morality. Dr. Tremaine, after his shorter sentence, was permanently stripped of his medical license. He moved to Mobile, Alabama, and lived out his days as a bitter, small-time accountant, obsessed with balancing ledgers that contained no human entries. His fear of the law never left him. He became a paranoiac, convinced every knock on the door was the arrival of a wronged, white-passing adult seeking their truth. The true, lasting legacy of the Vente Blanche was its deep and corrosive impact on the Southern mind. The trial confirmed the worst fears of the white elite, that the system designed to uphold racial purity was fundamentally corrupted by the greed of its most powerful practitioners. This fear did not lead to repentance. It led to reinforcement. Across the South, the enforcement of laws defining Negro blood became more draconian and obsessive in the years leading up to the Civil War. The trauma of the Immaculate Deception inadvertently strengthened the very system that had spawned it, driven by a panicked need to prove that what Caldwell had done was a unique, punishable aberration, not an inherent flaw of the entire structure. The shadow children, growing up in a world built on their biological lie, became America's first hidden test of its own racial laws. The system failed, but the secret endured. Closing reflection and final thoughts. The New Orleans story of the Immaculate Deception did not end with the judge's gavel or the prison door closing on John Caldwell. It ended with the silence of the sold. Imagine the children, Thérèse Laveau, Pierre, Isabelle, and the 17 others. They grew up in affluent homes in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, raised with every advantage of a privileged white life. They were educated, attended grand churches, and were taught the history of America through the lens of their adopted false identity. They never knew the smell of the Louisiana swamp or the deep guttural sound of the slave quarters' night drums. They were taught to scorn the very lineage that gave them life. The horror is not merely the crime that was committed, but the eternal, unknowable consequence. How many of these individuals went on to marry into prominent Northern abolitionist families, fighting the very system that created them? How many, unknowingly, inherited the cold eyes or the calculating ambition of their father, John Caldwell? Their lives became the ultimate horrifying secret woven into the American tapestry, a truth hidden in plain sight, carried in the bone and blood of the nation's elite. The white-passing children were the invisible, forced integration of the races, a perverse form of reconciliation born not of love or justice, but of brutal, clinical profit. The true victims were the mères de la lune, the mothers who carried the secret in their memory. Amélie Laveau vanished from the records entirely shortly after the trial, possibly sold to a distant plantation, or perhaps having fulfilled her terrible duty, she managed to find a freedom that was not recorded in any white man's ledger. But her act of defiance, the ivory brush, the recorded specifics of a freckle or an eye color, ensured that the truth remained a haunting potentiality. So, what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or was it buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story.